Well, welcome to a new Dave's Workshop Tours video, and this time I'm at the DerbyWorks in Melbourne.
The name may give you a clue as to what they specialise in, though as we'll find out, there's some surprising jobs underway inside that don't quite fit the tag of exclusive British brand.
Let's go inside and find out what they're up to. Simon, thank you very, very much for having us along today at DerbyWorks. Tell us a little bit about the business.
Right, my pleasure. The business I started about 20 years ago, 22 years ago. I was working at General Motors, and I was actually working night shift, and during the day I was getting people asking me to do Rolls Royce restoration work, which was what my previous, what I did my apprenticeship doing. And I eventually got so much work that I gave up General Motors and bought this place and started running my own business full time. So here I am.
Great stuff. Okay, would you like to show us about?
Okay, we've got a 1910 Roy de Belle's Rolls Royce Silver Ghost. One of a very early Silver Ghost. The first one was 1907. This car the owner has had for, I believe, around 30 years and has slowly pieced all the bits together. Unusually it's got the original body because most of them were modernised sometime between World War I and World War II because the chassis essentially looked the same, and so they would put a modern body on and people would think they're driving around in a brand new Rolls Royce rather than like a 20s Rolls rather than a 1910. Unfortunately, a lot of the bodies that they put on late, especially in the late 20s and early 30s, were pretty hideous. So those get scrapped and they put new bodies on. Fortunately, this one is actually a genuine body. So we haven't restored the car. The owner's done a lot of the work and had contracted a lot of the work himself, but he's given it to us to finish it off and get it running. So it hasn't run at this stage. So we're in the process of finishing it off and finding the final components and getting it all together.
And taking on somebody else's work like that, what problems does that present?
Well, obviously you don't know the quality or what's been done and what's been finished and what hasn't. In this case, we've found a lot of things that haven't been tight, haven't been checked. So we're basically starting from scratch and just checking everything, pulling a lot of the components down, particularly brakes, not the basic motor, but all the accessories, and going through them all. For instance, the water pump we found had no gland packing in it, so it just poured water out, and that put us on edge a bit. So everything, we're just carby, everything we're pulling apart and checking and putting back together.
An original body like this is surely it's a bit of a unicorn.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, I'm not sure how many with original bodies there'd be around, but it's one of the few that I've seen.
The Australian climate, how kind has it been to early Rolls-Royce models?
Very, although they were quite corrosion resistant anyway, because they tended to use very good quality high nickel content steels that were very resistant to corrosion. But obviously the Australian conditions are a lot better than Europe, so our cars are much better preserved in general, although a lot of them ended up with the wealthy farmers, and wealthy farmers just put things in the back shed and pull them apart and use the motors to pump water, or the chassis as a farm gate or what have you, where a lot of them have been found, or on the junkyards in farms and pieced back together. So a lot of them have suffered in that regard.
And parts for this kind of?
This early, very difficult. Some of the later 20s cars, there's plenty available because they built quite a few of them, and there's companies in England that make all the basic gaskets and points and all the consumable items that you could want. But with a car like this, you end up fabricating, casting, machining up the parts you need if they're missing or in poor condition, which is the case. We're actually converting this car to a starter motor because it was an old crank start car, and in modern traffic, and as the owners get older, it's not really what you want to be doing in the middle of peak hour traffic somewhere, trying to get out and crank start it because you've stalled it at the traffic lights. So that's just one. But we hide that sort of modification so it's not obvious.
Right, interesting. Is that for concours events, that down point or whatever?
Minor, but if you do it properly and do it sympathetically, you won't even be able to find this, because they've got full under trays, and unless you pulled the floors up or pulled the gearbox under tray or really got a torch in and had a look, into the flywheel gearbox area, it won't be noticeable. So it'll be done very discreetly. In my opinion, if it makes the car more usable and the owner more likely to drive it and enjoy it and use it rather than think, oh, you know, that's just too big a hassle to take out. Whereas if you've got a push starter, you can virtually just go for a nice 5-minute drive, which is good for the car, rather than just leaving it sit for months. And if it's done sympathetically, it can always be reversed. If you haven't damaged any of the original components to do it, I don't see a problem with doing it if it makes the car more usable. But if you're sort of drilling lots of holes and modifying original components irreversibly, then that's a problem. But you can do it without, so that's what we aim for.
What sort of use do you expect this car to get when it's finally out on the road?
People are often surprised how much they get used. These owners will ship them all over the world and use them on very extensive, you know, maybe month-long rallies, or, you know, Swiss Alpine Pass, you know, all the way through to Alaska, on very long rallies in, you know, sometimes fairly poor conditions. But they look after the cars and, you know, make sure they're serviced properly and maintained properly. A lot of people think, oh, well, they're just showroom items. Well, they're not, and they can be maintained and still look Concours, but be used thoroughly and properly. And a car like this, one of these was clocked in 1910 at 100 mile an hour by the factory, recorded, with a special lightweight body on it. So this will cruise at 70 mile an hour all day. You know, they don't stop so well. They only have rear wheel brakes on this very early model, and it's actually stopped by the handbrake. It has a foot brake, but that's only a tail shaft brake. But, you know, it's like driving any large vehicle or a car with a caravan. You just have to allow and have your wits about you and allow the right stopping distance for it.
Okay, great stuff. All right, and next up.
Yeah, okay.
So what have we got here?
An SB Alvis Speed 20. This has been quite an extensive project, because the car was bought from Europe and it was supposed to be a fully restored chassis. When it arrived, it was in very poor condition and missing a lot of components, and had a lot of components with the car that didn't belong with the car as well. So it's been quite a job. We've had to cast things like backing plates for the brakes, have all the cables made and components through to all the complex linkages to operate everything. The horn button itself had to be fabricated because we couldn't get one. It might look simple, but there's little contacts, and it's threaded and springs and inside it.
So that's the Bakelite cup. Well, obviously not made of Bakelite now.
Well, this piece is original with the controls, but we had to turn up the little knobs for the ends of the controls and the actual horn button itself. So that you can actually get certain various Bakelite and paper Bakelite and materials, but that is actually a modern sort of Delron plastic, but it's very hard to pick from the original. The steering wheel, well, started out as a rusty mess with all the covering gone, and this has been restored in-house and coated and sanded and filled and brought back to looking original and correct.
Certainly does. That's amazing. So how long will this job take?
Oh, this has been quite an extensive job, just trying to get parts, and it's been off at another company getting a body made for it, which is now made, and so we're doing the final assembly so it can go off and get the body fitted and then go for trimming. So it's in its final stages. We're just putting a heater in it, an aftermarket heater, but trying to do it discreetly because the owner doesn't want to freeze in winter and wants some comforts in it. So, but we try and hide all the pipe work and do it in a way that it looks like the factory's put it there. And this car will get used quite extensively for rallies, and they're quite a good high performance car, these, and nice handling, and yeah, reasonably fast. So, and we've actually put even though it all looks standard, it's got modern forged pistons and modern con rods and a modern forged crank and a little bit of an increase in capacity, so it'll have pretty good performance for the era. But still all cable brakes, but they work quite well if they're set up properly. I mean, they're huge brakes and it's four-wheel brakes, so it should be quite a nice handling car. We've had to, for instance, pieced together carburetors because we had 3 different carburetors. Correct, but one wasn't off a speed 20 Elvis, and we had to heavily modify it and cast up various components and fabricate various bits just to get a set of carbies, because we tried as we might, we couldn't buy the components for it, so had to make jigs and, you know, reposition butterflies and get them all set up. So it's been quite an extensive job.
Beautiful.
Yeah, well, even the exhaust manifold, we couldn't get one. That was cracked in 2 places in half, so that's had to be cast iron welded back together. So yeah, very big job.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, what have we got here then?
All right, well, this one is a 1925, so the first of the Phantom 1 Rolls Royces, so it replaced the Silver Ghost. Silver Ghost was produced from 1907 to 1920, well, late 24, I think even there were some in 25, and they were replaced by the Phantom 1. So it was, for an era where so much change took place, it showed how good the Silver Ghost was, that they kept it for such a huge amount of time. When you think of the advances in cars from before World War I till, you know, 1925, to keep basically the same model. There were changes to 4-wheel brake and what have you along the way, but still basically the same car. Whereas then they replaced it with the Phantom 1. The Phantom 1 still retained pretty much the 4-wheel brake Silver Ghost chassis, but they put a more modern, rather than a side valve, an overhead valve engine in the car. And so this one we've done a full major restoration on. The body's just come back from the painter, and we're fitting up all the trim pieces, windscreen, and, you know, we've rebuilt all the mechanicals, obviously, painted the chassis and checked its alignment. But this one's well and truly on the way to being back on the road.
What sort of history has this had itself?
I don't know the full history, but an Australian delivered car. The chap that owns it now is, I think, 80, and him and his father bought it together, I think, in the 70s. So it was restored, I think, in the late 60s, early 70s, and this is actually a reproduction body that was built in Sydney. A beautiful job, but it's not the original. But, you know, it was restored in the 70s. Well, by the time 2020 came along, it was on a farm in Wagga where it was stored, and fairly warm, I imagine, in the shed there and what have you, and the paint had gone off and the plating, and, you know, so we've just basically stripped it back to bare metal, stripped it back to a bare chassis, and restored it all back. So, yeah, got all out for it.
So, and what have we got over here?
This one is a pretty special car. This is a 1936 Phantom 3 Rolls Royce. Probably the last of the really complex hand-built Rolls Royces. This car was brought in from America, and then I'm not sure by whom, but then bought from Sydney by the current owner. It's been a massive project. It's actually got a new crankcase because the old one was rotted out, because they were quite an advanced design. They were a full alloy crankcase with wet sleeves, with O-rings, with rubber O-rings, aluminium cylinder heads, and the original crankcase had rotted out, and someone made a batch of them in the UK, but I believe it was sort of around $50,000 just for a bare crankcase, so it makes it a fairly expensive engine rebuild. This motor has actually been rebuilt 3 times. It was done in America, then it was done again in Australia with the new crankcase, but that job was not done correctly by the previous firm that did it, and we've had to start again. But we've gone a bit further than they did. The car's ended up having a full restoration this time with new paint, new upholstery, and you know, completely new wiring, and will be as good as new. Very special car. It has it's actually what's called sedanka, so that this front alloy section of the roof actually slides back into the rear section, so it ends up open fronted. There's a beautiful mechanism, and when you wind a handle, this actually cantilevers up and the front part of the roof slides down over it, and then you've got a little winder you put in and you wind it back down and it all disappears into the rear section of the roof.
Well, would it be for the benefit of the chauffeur, or is it a driver's
Well,
car?
unusually it's a limousine, but it's the chauffeur that ends up out in the open. So which is an unusual concept. With, you understand, with the Lord-elect, you end up on a nice day, you put the top down and the owner ends up in the sunshine. But
But would it have been sold as a driver's car though for the actual owner, or did they? It's at this level.
It was quite common to have a sedan, but they were quite commonly, virtually a limousine with a division. I mean, it's got the speakerphone, so the driver can talk to the owner of the vehicle that he's chauffeuring. The central wind-up division. I'm
just trying to get my head around the owner thinking of the driver having the nice experience, not summertime experience back in those days.
It's unusual.
Yeah. How long has this process all taken for you?
Oh, we've had it a couple of years, so 2 or 3 years it's been on the go, because there's always a lot of lag time. Both goes off for panel work and painting. There was a lot of machining work to be done on the engine, a huge amount of machining work. Basically, it's been converted from white metal bearings in the engine to modern shell bearings, because they're more reliable, and if you've got an issue, they're easier to replace. Quite a lot of machining had to be done on it.
And future usage for this one?
It'll get extensively used in rallies and, probably mainly around Australia, but it may venture to the UK or America.
Wonderful stuff. Wonderful. Okay, well, next up. Not quite. First off, 3 things you really ought to know about Rolls Royce. It wasn't until after World War II and the move of all Rolls Royce and Bentley car production to Crewe that the company began making complete cars. Up until 1939, both marques had sold rolling chassis, delivered to coach builders chosen by the buyer. The iconic hood ornament, the Spirit of Ecstasy, was commissioned by Baron John Edward Scott Montague and is said to be a likeness for his secretary turned mistress, Eleanor Thornton. It first appeared in 1911 and was subsequently adapted by sculptor of the statuette Charles Sykes and has adorned Rolls Royces ever since. Ever since the Goodwood plant opened in 2003, one man has been responsible for painting the pinstripes on all new Rolls-Royce cars. Given one mistake with the special paint results in the whole car needing a repaint, it's not surprising Mark Court earns a reported 6-figure salary. Okay, Simon, what have we got here?
This is a approximately 1927 WO Bentley, 3 litre. So before Rolls-Royce acquired Bentley, they were their own separate company, started by WO Bentley. That company went broke around 1930, so they're quite rare, the original WO Bentleys. They carry no component over to Rolls-Royce. Rolls-Royce kept nothing that WO designed or any of their parts or any of their cars when they bought the company. They simply kept the badge and made them a sporty version of the Rolls-Royce and used all Rolls-Royce components. So they were quite an advanced car in their era. They were 4 valve per cylinder overhead cam. This car in particular, they built about 1,600 3-litre Bentleys and about 3,000 cars in total before they went broke. This car is a beautiful Australian delivered car with an original Von den Pla body. Most of them have been converted to Von den Pla spec speed models, but this is actually the genuine thing rather than one that's been converted, with an original body and even some of the original upholstery and most of the original components. So very, very valuable and special car, this one, because it is so complete and original.
Would it be the only one in Australia? Or
Oh no, there is a handful of them. We tended to end up with a lot of good cars in Australia. There's some very wealthy farmers at the time that brought a lot of Rolls Royces and Bentleys into the country, and fortunately we've managed to keep some of them. A lot of them have left, but this car nearly left. This car was bought by a dealer in the UK, but the son of the previous owner found out it was for sale and bought it before the dealer shipped it out of the country. It was already on a full page ad in Octane prior to it being shipped, but he heard it was for sale, and through me, because I bumped into him in a bookshop and got introduced to him, and I used to work on this car when I was an apprentice, and so and it was rare because most of them are green, and it was red, and so I put two and two together and worked out it was the car I used to work on, and said, oh, that car's for sale at the moment. And so he contacted the owner and managed to buy it and keep it in the country, which is fantastic.
Wonderful.
It's just in for a routine service and maintenance. The owner looks after it very well, but wants to preserve as much of the original car as possible. So we always give it a good detail and make sure everything's sort of in top condition, but while preserving as much of it as we possibly can.
Leather out, the exterior leather then, that's not, I mean, what sort of temperature?
I believe that would have been replaced, but it's the original wooden frame. It is possible that it is the original, although I think it would be slightly different material to this originally. But certainly the leather upholstery, the front seats have been reupholstered, but the rear seats were original, and the dashboard's original, windscreen frame.
The steel sheds that are prevalent nowadays wouldn't have been around, but they wouldn't have had climate-controlled garages and such forth back in the day. So for that to have stayed original, that would be pretty much impossible.
It would be. I don't think I've seen one with the original covering on it.
But and again, usage for this car?
This car's used a lot. The owner probably will take it overseas, I would suspect, but they do some fantastic rallies. Some of my customers have been to South Africa, for instance, and once again, Alaska, through America, all through Europe, Eastern Europe. But this car does a lot of driving in Australia. A lot of the WR owners have been, well, right round Australia. They did the over-the-top rally that went from Melbourne to Perth, right round through over to Queensland, all the way around the outside of Australia, and back down again in one hit. So they're certainly not show items. They drive them and use them, and we maintain them accordingly so they can do those rallies.
And is that particular to Rolls Royce and Bentley owners? That's it for this time from the DerbyWorks. Make sure you subscribe and hit that bell for plenty more to come. And if you like what you've seen and are keen for me to follow a particular car's progress, please comment below and I'll put it on the list of DWT restos to follow.